The cold sidewalk. It was one of those bone-chilling mornings in Detroit when even the most durable winter coats seemed futile. The biting wind slithered through every crack, forcing anyone outside to clutch their jackets tighter. For 10-year-old Layla, no jacket was ever enough. She sat shivering on the corner of a bustling downtown street, her small frame huddled against the cold. Her knees were drawn to her chest as she clutched a cardboard sign she had scribbled on with an old marker. Just want a better tomorrow. I want to finish school. People passed her by like a river flowing around a stone, their heads bent to their phones or tucked into their collars against the wind. It was a city of hurry and survival, where no one had the luxury of stopping, even if they noticed a little girl with eyes full of hope sitting on the pavement. Leela had grown used to being invisible. She wasn't asking for much, just enough to help her parents find their footing again. They had lost their apartment nearly a year ago after her father's hours were cut at his janitorial job. Her mother had picked up extra shifts at a laundromat, but the paychecks were barely enough to cover food, let alone save for rent. Lila's stomach growled as she clutched her sign tighter, but the sound didn't bother her anymore. Hunger had become an unwelcome but constant companion. She longed for the warmth of her old bedroom, with its lavender walls and soft quilt, but those memories were slipping further away with every passing day. Now nights were spent in cramped shelters or the backseat of their aging car. She missed her friends from school too, though she doubted they even remembered her. The wind picked up, cutting through her threadbare jacket, and her fingers turned numb. Lila watched the blur of Detroit pass by. The honking cars, the clamor of street vendors, and the occasional sideways glance from a stranger who quickly looked away. Detroit was a tough city, and for a little girl like Leela, it wasn't just tough, it was unforgiving. A familiar stranger. Miles away, a man walked the same streets with a different perspective. Eminem, one of Detroit's most famous sons, was revisiting the city that had shaped him. Though his fame and fortune had taken him far, Detroit was still home. He wore a plain hoodie and jeans, blending in as much as someone of his stature could. He liked it that way, anonymous, and free to soak in the city without the constant interruptions of cameras and fans. As he walked past a familiar street corner, his eyes caught the words on a piece of cardboard. Just want a better tomorrow. I want to finish school. The sign was simple, but it hit him like a punch to the gut. He stopped in his tracks, his hands in his pockets, and studied the little girl holding it. Her expression was a mixture of hope and exhaustion, one he recognized all too well. He remembered being that kid, dreaming of something more, clinging to hope in a city that could swallow you whole. He knelt down in front of her, careful not to startle her. "Hey there," he said softly, offering a smile. Leela looked up, startled. People didn't stop, and they certainly didn't talk to her. "Hi," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "What's your name?" "Leela," she said, clutching her sign a little tighter. "That's a beautiful name," he said warmly. "What are you doing out here?" Leela hesitated, unsure if she could trust him, but there was something kind in his eyes, something that made her feel safe. "I'm just trying to help my family," she whispered. Eminem nodded, his heart heavy. "What do you want to do when you grow up?" Her eyes lit up, a flicker of excitement breaking through the cold. "I want to go to school. I want to learn things and help people. Maybe even get a house one day, like the other kids." Her words were simple, but they carried a weight that left him speechless. This little girl wasn't asking for the world, just a chance. A small act of kindness. Eminem stood and gave her a reassuring smile. "You're going to get there, Layla. You're stronger than most people out here. Don't forget that." Before she could respond, he was gone, disappearing into the crowd as quickly as he'd appeared. Layla watched him leave, clutching her sign and replaying his words in her head. For the first time in a long time, she felt a glimmer of hope. Minutes turned into hours, and Leela stayed on the corner, waiting for her parents to finish work. She didn't notice him at first when he returned, weaving through the crowd with purpose. "Hey, Leela," he said, crouching down again. This time, he held a pizza box and a thick, puffy jacket. Her eyes widened as she stared at him, then at the items in his hands. "Is that for me?" He nodded. "Figured you might be hungry. And you look like you could use this more than I can." Leela took the jacket with trembling hands, running her fingers over the soft fabric. It was the warmest thing she'd touched in months. She slipped it on, the sleeves a little too long, but she didn't care. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Eminem smiled. "You're welcome, Lila. You deserve it." The unbelievable offer. As she opened the pizza box and took her first bite, he watched her savor the moment. She offered him a slice, but he shook his head. "That's all for you." Her face lit up with gratitude, and for a moment, the harshness of the city seemed to fade. But Eminem wasn't done. He hesitated, then spoke. "Leela, I want to help you and your family. I know what it's like to struggle, and I know how hard it is to hold on to hope. I can't fix everything, but I can give you a start." She stared at him, unsure of what he meant. "I'm going to make sure you can go to school," he continued. "I'll help your family find a place to live. You don't have to worry about tomorrow, Leela. You've got people who care about you now." Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't cry. She simply smiled, a small, trembling smile that spoke louder than words ever could. For Leela, it wasn't just an offer, it was a lifeline. And for Eminem, it was a reminder that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness could change everything. A better tomorrow. True to his word, Eminem connected Layla's family with local charities and used his resources to ensure they had a place to call home. Lila went back to school, her dreams no longer distant but within reach. And though the city was still cold and tough, Leela carried something new in her heart, the belief that even in the harshest places, kindness could bloom. Her story became a quiet inspiration, a reminder that no matter how small the gesture, it could ripple into something much bigger. Detroit was still a city of struggle, but for Leela, it was also the city where a stranger stopped, saw her, and changed her life. A spark in the crowd. The streets of Detroit were always alive, but it was a restless, hurried kind of life. People rushed to catch buses, darted into cafes for a quick coffee, or walked with their heads down, lost in the glow of their phone screens. It was a city constantly in motion, every person carving their way through the chaos. Among the noise and movement, one man walked with a slower pace, his hands deep in the pockets of his hoodie. Eminem didn't stand out much in his understated outfit, and he liked it that way. To most passersby, he was just another figure blending into the backdrop of Detroit's gritty streets. But for him, walking these streets wasn't just about blending in, it was about remembering. Detroit wasn't just his hometown, it was the forge that had shaped him. Every corner held a memory, every crack in the pavement whispered a story of struggle, survival, and triumph. He'd been to the top, yet Detroit had a way of pulling him back, grounding him in the reality of what it meant to come from nothing. As he turned onto a busy street, something caught his eye. A small figure huddled on the sidewalk, holding a cardboard sign. The words, scrawled in shaky handwriting, hit him like a wave. "Just want a better tomorrow. I want to finish school." He stopped, the world around him fading into a distant hum. There was a raw honesty in those words that cut through the noise of the city. It wasn't a plea for pity, it was a cry for hope. Eminem's eyes moved from the sign to the girl holding it. She was young, no older than his own daughter had been at 10. Her thin jacket was clearly no match for the biting wind, and her small hands trembled as she clutched the edges of the cardboard. There was something in her posture, in the quiet resilience of how she sat there, that reminded him of himself at her age. He didn't approach right away. For a moment, he stood back, watching the scene unfold like a still frame in a chaotic movie. People passed her by, their expressions vacant, their strides unbroken. Some glanced at her briefly, but their eyes quickly darted away, as though acknowledging her presence might somehow make her plight their responsibility. He felt a tightness in his chest. This was the Detroit he knew, A city that could break your spirit if you let it. A city where survival often came at the cost of compassion. But he also knew another side of Detroit, a side that he had seen in the kindness of strangers who had helped him in his darkest moments. That side of the city, the side that cared, was the one he wanted to carry forward. Taking a deep breath, Eminem stepped forward. As he approached, he noticed the way she clutched her sign like it was her shield, her gaze wary but hopeful. She didn't look up at first, too accustomed to being overlooked. But when he crouched down in front of her, she finally lifted her head, her wide eyes meeting his. "Hey there," he said softly, his voice cutting through the noise around them. She blinked, startled. People didn't stop, and they certainly didn't talk to her. "Hi," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the city's din. "What's your name?" he asked, keeping his tone gentle. "Leela," she said, clutching her sign a little tighter, as if unsure whether to trust him. "That's a beautiful name," he said, offering her a small smile. "I'm Marshall. Can I sit for a minute?" She nodded hesitantly, watching as he sat down beside her on the cold concrete. For a moment, they sat in silence, the city swirling around them. "You look pretty cold," he said, breaking the quiet. "How long have you been out here?" "Since this morning," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "My mom and dad are at work. They'll be back later." He nodded, his chest tightening at the thought of a child spending hours alone on these streets. "You're a brave kid," he said. "What are you trying to do out here?" She hesitated, glancing at her sign. "I just want to help my family," she said finally. "We lost our apartment last year. My mom says we're saving to get a new place, but it's hard. I want to go back to school and help them." Her words hit him like a punch to the gut. This little girl wasn't asking for much, just the basics. A roof over her head. A chance to learn. Things most people took for granted. "You like school?" he asked, trying to keep the conversation light. She nodded, a small smile breaking through her shy demeanor. "I love it. I used to be good at math. My teacher said I was one of the best in my class. I miss it." Eminem felt a lump rise in his throat. He'd grown up knowing that kind of longing, the hunger to escape, to reach for something better. And here was this little girl, sitting on a cold sidewalk with nothing but her hope and a cardboard sign, dreaming of a better tomorrow. "You're going to make it, Leela," he said, his voice firm. "You're smart, and you've got a good heart. Don't let this city take that away from you." She looked up at him, her wide eyes searching his face. "Do you really think so?" He nodded. "I know so. You've got more strength than most people out here. Don't forget that." For the first time, her guard seemed to lower. Her shoulders relaxed, and she gave him a small, hesitant smile. For a moment, the city didn't feel so cold. As he stood to leave, he gave her one last reassuring look. "Stay strong, Leela. Things are going to get better." And with that, he disappeared into the crowd, leaving her with a spark of hope that burned brighter than the city lights around her. The return with a plan. The city's rhythm didn't pause for anyone, not even for a little girl with dreams too big to fit her small, weathered frame. As Leela sat on the corner, clutching the sign that had become an extension of her hope, she replayed her brief encounter with the kind stranger. His words lingered in her mind like the warmth of a fading sun. Things are going to get better. She wanted to believe him. She needed to believe him. But as the minutes stretched into hours, doubt crept in. People rushed past, their faces blending into a blur of indifference. The occasional glance her way felt like a tiny crack of light through a thick wall of shadows, but no one stopped. Her stomach grumbled again, the ache sharper now, but she ignored it. Leela's hands began to lose their feeling as the wind bit harder. She pulled her knees closer to her chest, hoping her parents would finish work soon. She didn't want them to see how cold and tired she was. They carried enough on their shoulders already. Then, through the crowd, she saw a figure weaving back toward her. Her heart leaped, but she hesitated to hope. Maybe it wasn't him. Maybe it was just her imagination. But as the figure grew closer, she recognized the familiar hoodie and the soft determination in his stride. It was the same man, the one who had stopped when no one else did, the one who had spoken to her like she mattered. Layla sat up straighter, her wide eyes locked on him. He was carrying something this time, and as he approached, she noticed the details: a pizza box balanced carefully in one hand and a thick, puffy jacket draped over his arm. A pair of gloves peeked out from one of the jacket's oversized pockets. "Hey, Layla," he said, his voice warm against the cold air. Her lips parted in surprise, and for a moment, she didn't know what to say. She wasn't used to people coming back, especially not for her. "I thought you might be hungry," he said, crouching down and holding out the pizza box like it was a treasure chest. "And you look like you could use this more than I can." He handed her the jacket, his smile small but genuine. Layla stared at him, her hands trembling as she reached for the jacket. The fabric was soft and heavy, the kind of warmth she hadn't felt in what felt like forever. She slipped it on quickly, the sleeves hanging past her fingertips, but she didn't care. She buried her hands into the gloves, savoring the unfamiliar luxury of heat spreading through her fingers. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible but heavy with emotion. He nodded, watching her reaction carefully. "You're welcome. You deserve it." Layla opened the pizza box slowly, as though afraid the food might disappear if she moved too quickly. The rich aroma filled the air, and she couldn't stop the small gasp that escaped her lips. She hadn't smelled something so delicious in months. "Go ahead," he said, gesturing to the box. She picked up a slice, her small hands trembling, and took a cautious bite. The warmth and flavor hit her like a burst of sunshine, and for a moment, the world around her melted away. She looked up at him, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Do you want some?" she asked, holding the box out toward him. He chuckled and shook his head. "That's all for you. Enjoy it." Layla smiled, a real, unguarded smile that made her look like the child she rarely got to be. "My parents are going to be so happy when they see this," she said between bites. "We don't get pizza a lot. This is really special." Her words struck him deeply. Something so simple, a slice of pizza and a warm jacket, was enough to light up her entire world. It was humbling. But he wasn't done. "Layla," he said, his tone growing more serious, "I've been thinking about what you told me earlier, about wanting to go to school and help your family." She looked at him, her expression curious and hopeful. "I know how hard it is to feel like the odds are stacked against you," he continued. "I've been there. I know what it's like to want something better, but not know how to get there. And I want to help." Her brow furrowed slightly, as if trying to understand what he meant. "I'm going to make sure you can go to school," he said, "not just for a day or a week, but for good. And I'm going to help your family get back on their feet. You don't have to do this alone anymore." Her eyes widened, and her mouth opened as if to speak, but no words came out. The weight of his promise hung in the air, almost too overwhelming to grasp. "Why?" she finally managed to whisper. He smiled gently. "Because I believe in you, and because someone once helped me when I needed it most. Now it's my turn to pay it forward." Tears welled up in her eyes, but she didn't cry. She just looked at him, her face a mixture of disbelief and quiet hope. "Thank you," she said, her voice cracking slightly. He placed a hand on her shoulder, his grip firm but reassuring. "You're going to do great things, Layla. I know it." And in that moment, for the first time in a long time, Layla felt something she hadn't dared to feel before, a sense of possibility, a chain reaction of hope. Layla sat in stunned silence as Marshall, she still didn't know who he truly was, stood back, his quiet presence a steady anchor in her whirlwind of emotions. Her mind raced to grasp the weight of his words. Could it be true? Was someone really going to help her family escape the relentless cycle of struggle? She traced her fingers over the soft fabric of the jacket, its warmth beginning to seep into her frozen body. For the first time in months, she didn't feel the sharp bite of Detroit's winter. The gloves fit snugly around her small hands, and the pizza's flavor still lingered in her mouth, a reminder that kindness could be as nourishing as food. Marshall crouched again, leveling his gaze with hers. "I'm going to need some help from you, though," he said, his voice gentle but firm. She tilted her head, her curiosity outweighing her disbelief. "What kind of help?" "I need you to keep dreaming," he said, his expression serious. "You've got big dreams, Leela, and they're worth fighting for. But it's going to take work, school, dedication, and some patience. Can you do that for me?" Leela nodded slowly, her wide eyes filled with determination. "I can try," she whispered. "That's all I ask," he said, a smile breaking through the weight of his words. Marshall pulled out his phone and made a few quick calls, his tone shifting from casual to commanding. Leila couldn't hear every word, but phrases like emergency shelter and long-term support reached her ears. She watched him in awe, unsure how a stranger could care so much about her family's future. "I've got a plan," he said when he hung up, his voice steady. "There's a shelter nearby with some open spots. It's warm, safe, and a good place for your family to regroup. I'll make sure you have a way to get there tonight." Leela's heart swelled with hope. A warm place to sleep, something she hadn't dared to dream about for months. "And after that," he continued, "I'll work with some people I know to get your parents the help they need. Housing, steady work, and maybe even a little extra to make sure you can get back to school." Her breath caught in her throat. "Why are you doing this for us?" she asked, her voice trembling. Marshall's gaze softened, and he knelt again to meet her eyes. "Because someone once gave me a chance when I thought I didn't deserve one," he said. "I know what it's like to feel invisible, to think the world's stacked against you. But you're not invisible, Leila. You're stronger than you know. And sometimes, all it takes is for one person to believe in you." Tears brimmed in her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. Instead, she nodded, her expression a mix of gratitude and determination. The hours passed quickly. True to his word, Marshall stayed with Leela until her parents arrived, their faces etched with exhaustion. At first, they were wary of the stranger talking to their daughter, but as he explained his plan, their guarded expressions melted into cautious hope. "I know it's hard to trust someone you just met," he said, his voice calm and steady. "But I promise you, I'm not here to take anything. I just want to help." Leela's mother clutched her husband's arm, her eyes glistening. "We've been trying so hard," she whispered. We didn't know where to turn." Marshall nodded, his understanding rooted in his own past struggles. "I've made some calls. There's a shelter nearby that's expecting you. From there, we'll work on something more permanent. You're not alone in this anymore." The family exchanged glances, their silence speaking volumes. Finally, Leila's father extended his hand, his grip firm but grateful. "Thank you," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "You don't know what this means to us." Marshall shook his head. "I think I do," he said softly. That night, as Leela and her family settled into a warm, clean shelter, she couldn't stop thinking about everything that had happened. The jacket still hung loosely on her small frame, its warmth a constant reminder of the kindness she'd been shown. But the most powerful gift wasn't the pizza, the jacket, or even the promise of a better future. It was the belief that someone had seen her, truly seen her, and decided she was worth helping. The next morning, she sat down with a notebook someone at the shelter had given her. She flipped to a blank page and, with a dull pencil, began to write. At the top of the page, she scrawled the words, "My dreams." Beneath it, she wrote, "Go back to school. Help my family. Make the world a little kinder." As she stared at the list, her heart swelled with determination. Marshall had given her more than food or warmth. He'd given her a new sense of purpose, and she intended to honor that gift, one dream at a time. The ripple effect. Marshall didn't stop there. Over the next few weeks, he worked quietly behind the scenes to ensure Layla's family had the resources they needed. Using his connections, he partnered with local organizations to provide housing, job opportunities, and access to education for the family. But his actions sparked something bigger. News of his anonymous efforts began to spread, inspiring others in the city to step forward and help their neighbors. Donations poured into shelters and charities, and volunteers began organizing community drives to support struggling families. Detroit was still a tough city, but Marshall's actions reminded everyone that kindness could ripple outward, creating waves of change. For Layla, the future no longer felt like a distant, unreachable horizon. It felt close, tangible, and full of promise. She kept the jacket and the gloves as a reminder of that cold day when everything changed, not because of a grand gesture, but because someone took the time to stop, to see her, and to believe in her. And as the city moved forward, so did she, one step closer to a better tomorrow. A foundation for tomorrow. Weeks turned into months, and the once unrelenting struggles of Layla's family began to ease, piece by piece. It didn't happen overnight, but every step forward felt like a miracle, proof that their lives didn't have to stay stuck in the cycle of survival. The small shelter where they'd stayed temporarily gave way to a modest apartment, arranged through a local housing initiative that Marshall had helped fund. For the first time in over a year, Layla had a real bed to call her own, a warm room to sleep in, and a window where she could see the world beyond the walls. Layla returned to school soon after, her re-enrollment expedited by another phone call from Marshall, who had quietly worked behind the scenes to ensure no red tape would slow her down. Walking into the classroom again felt like stepping into another life. The clamor of voices, the hum of lessons, the feel of pencils scratching across paper, it was everything she had missed. At first, she was nervous. She worried about being behind, about whether her classmates would remember her, or if the time she'd spent away would make her a stranger in their eyes. But her fears melted away when her teacher, Ms. Rodriguez, greeted her with a warm smile. "Layla," she said, bending down to meet her eye level. "It's so good to see you back. We've missed you." The words wrapped around Layla like a second layer of warmth, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she felt like she belonged. A special visit. One crisp spring morning, a few weeks after Layla's return to school, her mother received an unexpected phone call. The voice on the other end was friendly but professional, asking if it would be okay for a visitor to stop by their apartment later that day. When her mother hesitated, the caller explained, "It's someone who's been quietly supporting your family. He just wants to check in." By the time the knock came that afternoon, Layla's heart was racing. She told her parents about the kind man who'd stopped to talk to her on the street that cold winter day, but she hadn't seen him since. Could it really be him? Her father opened the door, and there he was, Marshall. Only this time, Layla noticed something different. His casual hoodie and baseball cap couldn't quite disguise the unmistakable familiarity of his face. Her father froze for a moment, his brow furrowing in confusion. "Wait a minute," he said, his voice tinged with surprise. You're that guy, the rapper." Marshall raised a hand, a small, sheepish smile tugging at his lips. "Yeah," he admitted. "But today, I'm just Marshall." Layla's mother stared at him, her eyes wide. "You've done all this for us." Marshall stepped inside and nodded. "You deserve it," he said simply. "I've been where you are. I know how hard it is to see a way out when every door seems closed." He glanced down at Layla, who was staring at him with awe and excitement. "And this little one right here. She's got big dreams. I just wanted to make sure she gets the chance to chase them. A gift for the future." After sitting down with the family and catching up, Marshall reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, neatly folded envelope. He handed it to Layla's father, who opened it carefully. Inside was a check, written out for an amount that made both parents gasp audibly. "This is for you," Marshall said, "to help you get on your feet and make sure Layla has everything she needs for school. It's not charity. It's an investment in her future." Tears welled up in Leela's mother's eyes, and her father struggled to find the words to respond. "I don't know how to thank you," he finally said, his voice breaking. "You don't have to," Marshall replied. "Just promise me one thing. Keep pushing forward. And when you're in a place where you can, pay it forward. Help someone else who's struggling, the way someone helped me once." Ripples of change. The impact of Marshall's kindness didn't stop at Lila's family. Word of his quiet generosity began to spread, sparking a wave of community action. Inspired by his story, local businesses and organizations started new initiatives to help struggling families in Detroit. Shelters received more funding, schools expanded their resources for at-risk students, and food banks saw an outpouring of donations. Marshall had never sought attention for his efforts, but he didn't shy away from using his platform to encourage others to step up. In interviews, he spoke about the importance of community, about how small acts of kindness could ripple outward and create meaningful change. For Leela, those ripples were personal. She carried the warmth of that winter day with her like a secret superpower, a source of strength that kept her going even when things felt hard. She excelled in school, fueled by the belief that someone had seen her potential and deemed it worth investing in. The next chapter. Years later, Leela stood in front of a packed auditorium, her high school graduation gown swaying as she stepped up to the podium. Her name had been announced as the valedictorian of her class, and as she looked out at the crowd, her eyes locked on a familiar face. Marshall sat quietly in the back, wearing his usual understated outfit, a proud smile on his face. Taking a deep breath, Leela began her speech. "A few years ago, I was sitting on a cold street corner, holding a sign and hoping anyone, would see me. I didn't know it at the time, but the man who stopped that day didn't just change my life. He gave me back my hope. He reminded me that even in the hardest times, there's light to be found." Her voice trembled, but she pressed on. "To everyone here, I want you to know this. No matter how small it seems, kindness matters. It can change a life. It changed mine." The crowd erupted in applause, but Leela only had eyes for Marshall, who gave her a small nod of acknowledgement. As she walked off the stage, diploma in hand, she knew this was only the beginning. Her dreams, once scrawled on a piece of paper in a shelter, were now within reach. And just as Marshall had once promised her, she was ready to pay it forward. And in the city of Detroit, where hope often felt like a scarce commodity, one little girl's story proved that even the smallest spark of kindness could ignite a brighter tomorrow. Paying it forward. The years after her high school graduation were a whirlwind of opportunities and growth for Leela. With the support of scholarships and a network of mentors, many of whom Marshall had discreetly connected her with, she went on to college, majoring in social work with a focus on community development. Her dream of giving back to Detroit was no longer just an idea. It was a mission she carried with her every single day. She remembered the long, cold nights spent on the streets, the hunger gnawing at her, and the exhaustion of watching her parents work tirelessly for a future that often seemed out of reach. Those memories weren't scars. They were fuel. They reminded her of how far she'd come and how many others were still living the life she had left behind. By the time she was 25, Leela had founded her own nonprofit organization, Tomorrow's Promise. Its mission was simple yet ambitious: to provide resources for families experiencing homelessness, focusing on education, job placement, and mental health support. She modeled the program on the very help her family had received, ensuring that it not only offered immediate relief, but also laid the groundwork for lasting change. The first day at Tomorrow's Promise. The grand opening of Tomorrow's Promise was an emotional event. The building, located in the heart of Detroit, had been renovated from a dilapidated community center into a warm, welcoming space. Its bright walls were decorated with inspiring quotes, and every corner was designed to feel safe and comforting. A stark contrast to the sterile environments Leela remembered from the shelters of her childhood. The lobby buzzed with activity as families began to pour in, their faces marked with a mixture of weariness and cautious hope. Leela stood at the entrance, greeting each person with a handshake and a smile. For many, she was a beacon of reassurance, someone who understood their struggles on a deeply personal level. One family in particular caught her attention, a mother with 2 young children, their clothes worn but clean, their eyes scanning the room with quiet apprehension. The little girl, who couldn't have been more than 8, clutched a faded stuffed rabbit, her tiny hands gripping it as though it were her lifeline. "Hi there," Leela said, kneeling to the girl's eye level. "What's your name?" "Amara," the girl replied softly, her voice barely audible. "Well, Amara," Leela said with a warm smile, "you're going to love it here. We've got a playroom with books and toys, and I think you'll find it's a pretty special place." Amara's eyes lit up, and for a moment, Leela saw herself in the child, a spark of hope in a sea of uncertainty. A familiar visitor. A week after the center's opening, Leela received an unexpected call. The voice on the other end was familiar, even though it had been years since she'd last heard it. "How's the new place running?" Marshall asked, his tone light but genuinely curious. "It's incredible," Lila replied, her voice brimming with excitement. "I can't believe how many families we've been able to help already, but we've still got so much to do." "I figured as much," he said with a chuckle. "That's why I'm calling. I want to stop by, if that's okay. I'd like to see it for myself." "Of course," she said, her heart racing. "It would mean the world to us." A few days later, Marshall arrived at the center, blending in with the bustling crowd as he stepped inside. He wore his signature hoodie and a Detroit Tigers cap, his presence understated but impossible to ignore. Leela greeted him with a hug, her gratitude spilling over. "You being here, it feels like coming full circle," she said, her voice thick with emotion. Marshall surveyed the center, his sharp eyes taking in every detail: the cheerful artwork, the resource rooms, the families laughing and chatting. "You've built something incredible here," he said, nodding in approval. "This is what it's all about." The ripple expands. As word spread about tomorrow's promise, more people wanted to get involved. Local businesses donated supplies, volunteers offered their time, and former beneficiaries returned to give back, creating a cycle of generosity and support. Marshall, ever the quiet benefactor, continued to support the center financially, but his involvement went beyond writing checks. He would visit occasionally, sitting down with the families, listening to their stories, and reminding them that their struggles didn't define them. During one visit, he pulled Leela aside. "You've done something here that most people only dream about," he said. "You didn't just change your life. You've changed this entire community." Leela smiled, her eyes glistening. "I couldn't have done it without you. You showed me what was possible when someone believes in you." He shook his head. "All I did was light the spark. You're the one who built the fire." A new generation of hope. Years later, Tomorrow's Promise had grown beyond its humble beginnings. It expanded into multiple locations, each one serving as a lifeline for families in need. Lila's story became a source of inspiration, shared in classrooms, community events, and even national platforms. But for Leela, the most rewarding moments were the quiet ones. Seeing a child leave the center with a backpack full of school supplies, watching a parent smile as they received a job offer, or hearing someone say, "I finally feel like I belong." One day, as she was organizing a donation drive, a young woman approached her with a nervous smile. "Ms. Leela?" "Yes," Leela said, turning to face her. "I just wanted to say thank you," the woman said, her voice trembling. "When I was a kid, my family came here. We didn't have anything, but you gave us hope. Because of this place, I got to go to college. And now I'm a social worker, just like you." Leela felt her chest tighten with emotion. "You're exactly why we do this," she said, her voice steady but filled with pride. As the woman walked away, Leela glanced at a framed photo hanging on the wall of her office. It was an old picture of her younger self, sitting on that cold Detroit street corner, holding the cardboard sign that had once carried all her hopes and dreams. Below the photo was a simple plaque that read, "Sometimes, all it takes is one person to believe in you." And as Leila turned back to her work, she knew the cycle of hope would continue, one life at a time. The power of one. As Leila stood in the lobby of Tomorrow's Promise, watching families find warmth and hope within the walls she had built, she reflected on the incredible journey that had brought her here. From a cold street corner in Detroit to creating an organization that changed lives, the path had been anything but easy. Yet every hardship had taught her resilience, every challenge had shaped her resolve, and every act of kindness, no matter how small, had strengthened her belief in the goodness of people. Her story wasn't just hers, it belonged to everyone who had crossed her path. It belonged to her parents, who had worked tirelessly to provide, even when they had nothing left to give. It belonged to Marshall, whose compassion had turned a cold day into a turning point. And it belonged to the countless families who had walked through the doors of Tomorrow's Promise, each carrying their own hopes and dreams. As the center bustled around her, she noticed Amara, the little girl she had met on opening day, laughing with another child in the playroom. The sight brought a smile to her face. Amara's mother had recently found a stable job, and their family was well on their way to rebuilding their lives. Leila walked to her office and sat down at her desk, where the old cardboard sign was framed on the wall. The words, "Just want a better tomorrow. I want to finish school," had once been a desperate plea. Now, they were a reminder of how far hope could carry you when someone extended a hand. A lesson for all. That evening, Leila spoke at a community event, sharing her story with an audience filled with families, supporters, and local leaders. She stood behind the podium, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "My life changed because someone took the time to stop, to see me, and to believe in me," she began. It wasn't a grand gesture or a huge announcement. It was a moment of connection, a spark of kindness that lit a fire in my heart. She paused, her eyes scanning the crowd. "The lesson I want to leave you with is this: never underestimate the power of a small act of kindness. You may think it's just a word of encouragement, a helping hand, or a single moment in time, but for someone else, it could be the beginning of everything." The audience listened intently, the room filled with a quiet reverence. "Every one of us has the power to create change," she continued. "It doesn't take fame or fortune, just a willingness to care. Imagine what our communities could look like if we all decided to stop for a moment, to see the people around us, and to act with compassion. That's how we build a better tomorrow." The applause that followed was thunderous, but Leila didn't need the recognition. What mattered most to her was the impact, the ripples of change that would continue to grow long after the event ended. A life well lived. Years later, Leila would look back on her life and see not a series of struggles, but a tapestry of triumphs woven from the threads of resilience, hope, and community. She would see the faces of the children who had walked through Tomorrow's Promise, the families who had rebuilt their lives, and the volunteers who had given their time and hearts to make it all possible. And at the center of it all, she would see the moment that had started it, the day a stranger in a hoodie knelt down in front of a cold, hungry girl and offered her not just a jacket or a pizza, but a reason to believe. The legacy of kindness. The story of Leila and Tomorrow's Promise became a reminder to people everywhere that greatness isn't measured by wealth or fame, but by the lives you touch. It taught that even in the harshest places, a single act of kindness could ripple outward, creating waves of change that reached far beyond what anyone could imagine. Because sometimes, all it takes to change the world is one person who stops to care. And for Leila, the lesson was clear. The power to make a difference lies in every one of us. All we have to do is use it. This concludes the story. Thank you for watching until the end. I hope you found it enjoyable. If you did, please consider liking the video and sharing it with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and activate the notification bell for more captivating stories. Have a great day.